The boots by the fence. The dust kicked up from Jake Morrison's horse settled slowly in the still morning air as he rode the familiar path that skirted the Henderson property. 23 years he'd been making this same ride, checking his cattle, mending fences, and pretending he didn't notice the small farmhouse that sat like a white pearl against the rolling green of Sarah Henderson's wheat fields. 23 years since he'd come back from the war with a piece of Confederate shrapnel lodged too close to his heart for any doctor to remove, and a disposition that had grown as hard and weathered as the Wyoming landscape around him. 23 years since he decided that a man who couldn't promise tomorrow had no business making plans that included anyone else. But this morning, like every morning for the past 6 months, his eyes found those boots. They sat neat as you please by the split-rail fence that divided his grazing land from her cultivated fields. Small, practical brown boots with worn heels and leather that had been loved soft by years of honest work. Sarah Henderson's boots, abandoned there while she went about her morning chores barefoot in the dewy grass, her skirts hiked up just enough to keep the hem dry. Jake never slowed his horse, never turned his head to look direct, but that smile, Lord help him, that smile crept across his weathered face every single time. It was the only soft thing left in him, that smile saved up special for those boots and what they meant. See, those boots told a story that Jake Morrison understood better than any words ever could. They spoke of a woman who worked her land with her own 2 hands, who wasn't afraid to get dirt under her fingernails or sweat on her brow. They spoke of someone who knew the value of good leather and careful mending, who could make things last when money was scarce and the nearest town was a hard day's ride. They spoke of a woman who trusted her neighbors enough to leave her boots where anyone might take them, which in this part of Wyoming was saying something considerable. Most of all, they spoke of Sarah Henderson herself, widow these past 8 years, mother to 2 half-grown children, and the finest woman Jake Morrison had ever had the privilege to pretend he wasn't noticing. The pretending had become something of an art form over the years. When Sarah's husband Thomas had taken sick with the fever and died, leaving her with a mortgage, 2 children, and a farm that was more dream than reality, Jake had found ways to help that looked like anything but helping. A few of his cattle would wander onto her land just when she needed fertilizer for her fields. His fence would develop breaks that required him to ride past her property daily, keeping an eye on things. When wolves threatened her chickens, Jake's hunting had improved remarkably, and he'd taken to leaving the occasional carcass where she might find it and assume it was one of her own birds that had wandered back. Sarah, being no fool, had understood the game from the beginning. She'd leave fresh bread cooling on her windowsill when she knew he'd be riding past, and somehow her well always needed checking right around the time Jake's horse required watering. When his coat had gotten torn by barbed wire last winter, he'd found it mended and hanging on his fence post the next morning. The stitches so fine and even they might have been done by fairy folk. They'd been dancing around each other like this for years, 2 people too proud and too careful to disturb the delicate balance they'd created. Jake, because he'd convinced himself that a man with a war wound and a reputation for solitude had nothing to offer a woman with children and responsibilities. Sarah, because she'd learned the hard way that loving someone meant risking loss, and she'd already buried one good man. But those boots by the fence, they were new to the dance, and they were changing everything. The first time Jake had seen them there 6 months back, he'd thought maybe Sarah was just airing them out. Second time, he'd figured it was coincidence. By the third time, he'd begun to suspect that maybe, just maybe, Sarah Henderson was trying to tell him something. The boots appeared every morning now, regular as sunrise. Sarah would set them by the fence post closest to the path Jake rode, always positioned just so, like she wanted to make sure they caught the light. Sometimes there'd be wildflowers tucked into the tops, Indian paintbrush or lupine that she'd gathered while walking her property. Once, after a particularly bad storm had knocked down half his fence, Jake had found those boots sitting next to a basket of fried chicken and biscuits, with a jar of her famous peach preserves tucked underneath a checkered cloth. He'd eaten every bite, sitting there on his horse in the morning sun, and when he'd left the empty basket back by the fence the next day, he'd tucked one of the better roses from his mother's old garden inside. The rosebush had been growing wild by his cabin for near on 20 years, the only soft thing he'd allowed to flourish on his property. Sarah must have understood what it meant for him to cut one of those roses, because the next morning her boots had been polished to a shine that could have been seen from the next county. That was the morning Jake Morrison finally admitted to himself that he was in love. Not the gentle, comfortable sort of love that grows between people who've known each other since childhood, but the fierce, desperate sort that could make a man forget all his careful reasons for staying alone. The sort that could make a 43-year-old confirmed bachelor start thinking about things like Sunday dinners and children's laughter and what it might feel like to have someone to come home to. The admission terrified him. For 2 weeks after that, Jake had changed his route, riding the long way around his property to avoid the Henderson place entirely. But the cattle needed checking near the south pasture, and the south pasture bordered Sarah's wheat fields, and eventually a man had to choose between his livestock and his cowardice. When he'd finally ridden past again, those boots had been waiting right where he'd left them in his mind, faithful as sunrise. There'd been a small folded paper tucked into one of them, and Jake had sat his horse for a full 10 minutes before finding the courage to dismount and read it. The coffee's always hot around dawn, it had said in Sarah's careful school teacher handwriting. In case you ever get tired of pretending you don't see me watching you ride past. Jake had folded that paper and put it in his shirt pocket, right over the piece of shrapnel that the doctors said would kill him someday. It was still there now 3 months later, creased from handling and soft with wear, but he hadn't taken her up on the invitation. Not yet. See, Jake Morrison had learned some hard truths during his 43 years on this earth. He'd learned that good men died young and left women to struggle alone. He'd learned that love could be a luxury that poor folks couldn't afford, and that wanting something didn't mean you deserved to have it. Most of all, he'd learned that some things were too precious to risk spoiling with clumsy hands and good intentions. Sarah Henderson was the finest woman in 3 counties. She deserved better than a scarred-up old soldier with more yesterdays than tomorrows and a tendency to wake up screaming from dreams he couldn't quite remember. She deserved someone who could promise her forever, not someone who carried his own mortality around like a pocket watch, always aware of its ticking. But Lord help him, those boots by the fence were wearing down his resistance like water on this particular morning. As Jake rode past and felt that familiar smile tug at his mouth, he noticed something different. There was only one boot by the fence post. Jake slowed his horse without meaning to, his eyes scanning the area around the fence. Sarah's property looked normal enough, chickens pecking in the yard, her vegetable garden showing the first green shoots of spring, smoke rising steady from the chimney, but there was only one boot sitting lone and somehow forlorn by the split rail. Before he could talk himself out of it, Jake swung down from his horse. The single boot was Sarah's left one. He could tell by the particular way the leather had worn at the ankle where she favored that side when she walked. It was polished as always, and there was a sprig of early lavender tucked into the top, but where was its partner? Looking for something, Mr. Morrison? Jake spun around, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip before his mind caught up with his reflex. Sarah Henderson stood not 10 feet away, and she was wearing only one boot. She had on her working dress, a practical brown calico that had seen better years but was clean and carefully mended. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, with the sort of tendrils escaping that suggested she'd been working in her garden. Her hands were dusted with flour like she'd been interrupted in the middle of making bread, and she was smiling at him with the sort of expression that suggested she'd been planning this moment for quite some time. Mrs. Henderson, Jake managed, snatching his hat from his head and holding it against his chest like a shield. I was just... The cattle are fine, Miss Morrison. They're in your north pasture, same as always. Sarah took a step closer, and Jake noticed that her stockinged foot didn't seem to be bothering her any. I was wondering if you might help me with something. Of course, ma'am. Anything you need. Sarah's smile grew wider. I seem to have lost my boot. Jake glanced down at the lone boot by the fence, then back at Sarah's face. She was looking at him with those clear gray eyes that had haunted his dreams for more years than he cared to count, and there was something in her expression that made his chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with Confederate shrapnel. It's right there, ma'am, he said carefully. Is it? Sarah looked where he was pointing, as if seeing the boot for the first time. Well, would you look at that? But that's only one boot, Mr. Morrison. A lady needs 2 boots to be properly dressed. Jake felt heat creep up his neck. Yes, ma'am, that's generally true. The thing is, Sarah continued, taking another step closer, close enough now that Jake could smell the sunshine in her hair and the faint scent of the lavender soap she made herself. I can't seem to find the other one anywhere. I've looked all over my property, under the porch, in the chicken house, even down by the creek. It's just vanished. That's troubling, ma'am. Very troubling. Sarah nodded gravely. A woman can't very well go to town with only one boot. People would talk. Jake nodded, because that was certainly true. People in their small Wyoming community would indeed talk about a woman who showed up to church or the general store wearing only one boot. I could help you look for it, he offered. That's very kind of you, Mr. Morrison, but I have a confession to make. Sarah's smile turned slightly mischievous. I don't think we're going to find it on my property. No, ma'am. No, sir. See, I have reason to believe that boot might have wandered off onto someone else's land. Boots do that sometimes, you know, especially when they're trying to make a point. Jake felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. What sort of point would a boot be trying to make, Mrs. Henderson? Well, Sarah said, and now she was close enough that Jake could see the gold flecks in her gray eyes. I think this particular boot might be trying to tell a certain stubborn rancher that it's time to stop pretending. Pretending what? Pretending that he doesn't see me watching him ride past every morning. Pretending that he doesn't notice when I leave flowers in my boots or food by the fence. Pretending that he doesn't care enough to come calling like a proper gentleman, instead of helping me from a distance like some sort of guardian angel who's too proud to show his face. Jake's throat felt dry as desert sand. Mrs. Henderson. Sarah, she corrected softly. My name is Sarah Jake Morrison, and you've been avoiding using it for 8 years. 8 years of Henderson this, and ma'am that, like we're strangers instead of neighbors who've been dancing around each other since my husband died. Sarah, her name felt strange on his tongue, too intimate and too right all at once. I never meant to, that is, I don't want you to think. What don't you want me to think? Sarah reached out and touched his arm, just a light pressure of her fingers against his shirt sleeve, but it sent electricity shooting through Jake's entire body. That you're a good man who's been looking after me and my children. That you're kind and decent and lonely. That you've got the most beautiful smile I've ever seen, even though you try so hard to hide it. Jake stared down at her, his carefully constructed walls crumbling like old mortar. Sarah, you don't understand. I don't have anything to offer a woman like you. I'm just an old soldier with more scars than sense and a piece of metal in my chest that could kill me any day. You deserve better than that. You deserve someone who can promise you forever. Sarah's grip on his arm tight. Jake Morrison, you listen to me. I buried one husband already. God rest his soul. Thomas was a good man, and I loved him dearly, but he was taken from me by a fever that lasted 3 days. 3 days, Jake. No warning, no long illness, just there one morning and gone the next. Her voice caught slightly, but she continued. There's no such thing as forever, not in this life. There's only today, and maybe tomorrow if we're lucky. And I've spent 8 years watching you ride past my fence, 8 years seeing the way your face lights up when you think no one's looking, 8 years wishing I had the courage to walk out to that fence and ask you to stay for coffee. Why didn't you? Jake asked. Same reason you never came to the door, I expect. Fear, pride, the certainty that a woman with 2 children and a struggling farm had no business setting her sights on the finest man in 3 counties. Jake laughed, short and bitter. Finest, Sarah, I haven't spoken more than 10 words at a time to another human being in years. I live alone in a cabin that's barely bigger than your chicken house. I've got a reputation for being unfriendly at best, and downright antisocial at worst. You've got a reputation for being reliable, Sarah corrected, for keeping your word, for helping your neighbors without being asked and without expecting thanks, for being honest and hard-working, and, she paused, color rising in her cheek, for being handsome enough to make the widow ladies at church fan themselves when you come to town. Sarah Henderson, Jake said, and now he was smiling despite himself. Are you flirting with me? I'm trying to, Sarah admitted. I'm somewhat out of practice. It's been 8 years since I've tried to catch a man's attention, and I'm not entirely sure I remember how it's done. Well, Jake said, and surprised himself by reaching up to cup her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I think you're doing just fine. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the morning sunlight, 23 years of careful distance dissolving like mist. Jake could feel Sarah's pulse fluttering under his fingers, could see the way her lips parted slightly as she looked up at him. Sarah, he said softly, I have to tell you something. What? I think I might know where your other boot is. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Do you now? Yes, ma'am. I believe it might have wandered onto my property sometime during the night. Boots are funny that way. They tend to go where they're wanted most. And where might that boot be? Exactly. Jake's smile grew wider. I reckon it's sitting on my kitchen table right about now, next to a pot of coffee and whatever's left of the biscuits I made for breakfast, probably wondering when its owner might come looking for it. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said, and her voice was slightly breathless. Are you inviting me to breakfast? I believe I am, Mrs. Henderson, though I should warn you, I'm not much of a coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, and the biscuits are harder than they ought to be. That's all right, Sarah said. I happen to be very good at making biscuits. Perhaps we could work out some sort of arrangement. What sort of arrangement? The sort where I make the biscuits, and you provide the coffee and the company. The sort where we stop pretending we don't care about each other and start figuring out what comes next. Jake felt something ease in his chest, something that had been wound tight for more years than he could count. And what do you think comes next, Sarah? I think, Sarah said, standing up on her toes to brush a kiss across his cheek, that comes next is coffee and conversation, and getting to know each other properly. I think it's Sunday dinners and shared chores and maybe, if we're very lucky, the sort of love that makes everything else worthwhile. Even if I can't promise forever, Jake, Sarah said seriously, no one can promise forever, but I think we might be able to promise today, and tomorrow, and maybe the day after that, for as long as we're given. Jake looked down at this remarkable woman who had somehow seen past his scars and his solitude to find something worth loving. Sarah Henderson, he said, would you do me the honor of having breakfast with me? I thought you'd never ask, Sarah replied. And so Jake Morrison, who had spent 23 years riding past the Henderson place without stopping, finally helped Sarah onto his horse and rode with her to his cabin, where her missing boot was indeed waiting on his kitchen table, polished and patient as a promise. Later, much later, after the coffee had been drunk and the biscuits had been properly made and eaten, after they'd talked through the morning and into the afternoon about everything and nothing, Jake would ask Sarah to marry him. She would say yes without hesitation, and they would be wed the following month in a ceremony that the whole county would attend. But that morning, as they sat at Jake's small kitchen table sharing coffee and watching the sun climb higher in the Wyoming sky, they were content to simply be together, two lonely people, who had finally found the courage to stop pretending they didn't need each other. And outside, by the fence that divided their properties, a single brown boot sat in the morning sun, a silent witness to the fact that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single step in the right direction.